Hi, it's Jennifer from Shabby Fabrics. We're back to finish up our intermediate quilt. Your blocks should be all put together. Just a reminder, the blocks do need to measure 12.5 inches. If they measure 12.25, we do have a little bit of slippage. I'll help you understand how to manage that. If your block is as small as 12 inches or less, and they're all that size, that's fine. Just reduce your sashing to be whatever that size is. It is important that you have all the blocks measuring about 12.5. If you start trimming your blocks down, you'll lose points. You'll lose your points of your block. So I've done this before when my blocks weren't so great and I started trimming, and all of a sudden my points weren't so pointy anymore, and they were kind of finishing like that. Once you've got the blocks, they're the right size. Now we talk about sashing. The sashing is the part that's in between the block and framing the block. This is sashing, whereas this is inner border. Even though it's the same fabric, it's called a different thing because it's used in a different location. So this is sashing, and these are called cornerstones. You will need sashing. Of course, that's in the download. We'll tell you how much to cut, but you'll start with 1.5 inch strips, 1.5 up the width of the fabric. Once you have those strips cut, and you'll be able to get just 3 sashing strips out of each full width of fabric cut, I like to lay those on my table, horizontal like this. This is folded in half. Let's just go ahead and clean up that edge. And what I love about the 6.5 by 12.5 inch ruler is I simply lay that on, and that ruler is 12.5. So if I am lined up with the end of my fabric, I simply cut. And that's 2 of my sashings right here. That's 12.5 and 12.5. For this fabric, which has the fold, I like to take that to my pressing mat and press straight down. Don't do any kind of wiggling, or your last sashing strip is going to have a little bit of a wave in it, which you don't want. Especially when you're putting a black sashing strip, it's really profound, it's very bold. So if you do have a little bit of a curve in that, it's definitely going to be noticeable. Okay. And then one more time, we'll take that with our ruler. And we line up that white line there, so I'm square to let's be square to our fabric. There we go. And then you just have a little bit of extra fabric for your stash. That's how stashes start, by the way. They're the leftover fabrics from your kits, and of course you don't want to throw that away, and that's why they make great scrap quilts, because when you keep all these pieces and you sew them all together in a quilt later on, you can reminisce about, oh, I remember when I made the Learn to Quilt Intermediate quilt, and I remember when I made that, and now it's just a beautiful reminder of all of those quilting experiences, and now you have a whole new quilt. So I love, love, love keeping my scraps and making a quilt later on. When you have your sashing strips, it's very straightforward. Right sides together. Let me bring these closer to me. Put those aside. And these are the bottom 3 blocks. I just grab the bottom 3. Normally I would start with the top 3 and add the sashing, but it really doesn't matter. Right sides together. Now, we know that sashing strip is 12.5 inches. Do all of my blocks come out at 12.5? I would love to tell you they do, and they don't always come out. Sometimes they're just a little bit bigger, but more cases than not, they may be just a little bit under. One thing you do know is that this sashing strip is 12.5 inches. For that reason, I like to pin here and pin here, assuming my block is 12.5 inches. If your block is under by 12.5, say it's 12.25, it's okay that your sashing strip extends just a little bit beyond the block and a little bit below the block, and you just understand that now that's your new guide. So that's a whole nother discussion of what do you do when your block doesn't measure whatever the measurement is supposed to be. For now though, what I'm going to do is pin Pin where I know it has to happen. I know that's where that sashing strip has to happen. And I know down here is where that sashing strip has to happen. And I'll pin. And then you just gently, sometimes the very way that a block isn't pressed maybe as completely flat as it could be, that's going to make that side slightly smaller than 12.5. So just by kind of pressing things out with my hands, I can make this whole thing work out beautifully. And you can too. And simply go ahead, take that to the sewing machine, sew a 1/4 inch seam allowance, and press toward the sashing, press toward the sashing. You've got all of these intersections coming in here, right? Press away, press toward that sashing. You'll do that here, same story here. Let's bring our sashing in. It looks like we're pretty good at 12.5. Right sides together, pin here, and everything in between. Then once that's attached, no surprise there. I'm just going to take those pins out and pretend that that's sewn together. We're going to pretend that that's sewn right there. And that one's sewn. You'd simply bring your blocks right side together and sew them in a row. No surprises pressing toward the sashing. What about this whole business of cornerstones? It's similarly easy peasy. We've already cut 3 strips, so let's pretend these are sewn together. I'm going to go ahead and move this out of the way for now so that we can bring these closer. Pretending that's all sewn together. Sashing strips, also the horizontal strip here, also 12.5, 12.5, and 12.5. We have our little squares. These are called cornerstones. 1.5 inches and 1.5 inches. Nothing to it. Right sides together. And you're going to press toward the black. Once that's together, once again, press toward the black, and you continue here, and now you have that strip. So you can see that once you have your row that has 2 sashing strips connecting the 3 blocks, and you've done that for 1, 2, and 3, that's where making your sashing strip and cornerstone section is really kind of your connector. So let's go ahead. Off camera, I'm going to sew this row of blocks together with the 2 sashing strips in between. I'm going to go ahead and sew that to, I'll show you what I have here, the rest of the quilt that already has the cornerstones and the sashing on that. Then we'll take it to our inner border and we'll take it to the outer border, which you've already seen in the basics if you've gone through the basic course, but we'll go ahead and talk about it. It's a little bit different because we'll be cutting our borders this time length of grain instead of width of grain. So when I come back, I'll take you to that step and we'll finish up your quilt. Here are the 9 blocks sewn together with the sashing and cornerstones connecting everything. 9 beautiful blocks. You have a lot to be proud of at this point. So congratulations, we're almost done. We're going to be adding the inner borders and the outer borders right now. Now, if you went through the beginner series with me, for the inner borders and the outer borders, we simply cut strips the length of the fabric, and we'll still do that. So you're still going to be cutting your inner border strips to 1.5 by width of fabric, and you'll need 4 of those. That information is in your download. But I want to introduce something that is new to the Intermediate Quilting series. If you recall back, if you went through that series, we just had you sew that strip on, and the strip was longer than the blocks themselves. We had you sew that on there, press to the outside, and just trim the excess off. You still have that option. I also want to introduce to you a little bit more advanced idea of cutting those strips to the exact length of what they should be. Let's go over what they should be technically if your blocks were perfect and your sewing is perfect. And by the way, none of us are perfect, but let's try to get as close as we can. What that would mean is this is 12 inches finished. 12, how I do the math on this, and I know there's a raw edge, every time we sew a seam, it should be 1/4 of an inch. For simplicity's sakes, 12, 24, 36, 37, 38 inches, but I have a 1/4 inch seam that I will lose eventually, and a 1/4 inch seam here that I will lose. So those are actually 12 1/4 inch blocks right now. So 38.5 inches is what I will need for my 2 side inner borders. So you have the option of just cutting 1.5 inch by width of fabric strips, sewing the entire strip on here, of course, without the selvage, and it's going to be longer, right? That strip's going to be about 43 to 40 inches long, whereas this is only 38.5 inches long right now. No problem with doing that. Most of the quilts in my house are made just like that. But if you want to be more precise, when you cut that strip, cut it down to be 38.5 inches, you'll pin here, and everything in between. You sew that to the sides of your quilt. Now keep in mind that once you have the inner borders put on the sides of the quilt, the top and bottom inner borders will be different because now you're traveling a further distance to compensate, and those will be 40.5. Those measurements will be in the download. We're going to mention this option in the download so that you can either do it the way I taught you before, where you just sew the whole strip on, press to the outside, trim to be even with the quilt. But if you want to go ahead and cut those to the exact size, and that's true of the inner border and the outer border, you'll go ahead and do that, and the measurements are provided for you. I want to talk to you a little bit about outer borders. In the first quilt we did, which only had 6 blocks, we were able to cut our width of fabric strips, and they were long enough to cover all of the blocks. In this particular case, across the top of the quilt, which is our longest measurement for outer border, width of fabric, normal cotton quilting fabric is only at most about 44 inches and even slightly under nowadays of width of fabric cut. So what do you do if your borders need to be longer than that? Well, you've got 2 options. You can either cut more than 1 border strip per side of the quilt and do a splice. Not my favorite. I don't like splices. Sometimes I don't have an option. I may have a limited amount of fabric and I don't have the option to buying more. I will do a splice. But if I can avoid that and I can have my beautiful borders be in 1 continuous piece of fabric, we will do that, and that is exactly how we've cut your kits. So let me show you your outer border fabric. Rather than giving you a piece of fabric that was regular width of fabric and relying on you to go ahead and make a splice in your borders, and you have a diagonal seam or what's called a butt joint, which I don't like, especially if you're dealing with a floral motif. It's very obvious, unless you're really exceptional at matching that repeat and blending that, you're going to see those seams. For that reason, this is the size, this is the outer border that is in your kit. This is 50 inches in length, but half of the width. So we at Shabby Fabrics are very mindful. I'm a quilter. I am very mindful. I don't like those seams, and I don't want to put those on you either. And so most of our kits, you will find the outer border is length of fabric to accommodate that, so that you too can have basically no seams in your outer border, no unsightly seams. I don't like them. So next question that I get from people is, how do I cut this thing? This is far larger than any cutting mat I have or any ruler I have. So the first thing that I would recommend that you do is definitely add sizing. I like to add sizing to everything I'm doing these days, and especially now. So I would certainly be adding sizing to your sashing if you didn't already do that. Of course, you probably are past that step at this point. But for this in particular, I'm going to match up my selvage with the fold toward me right now. I'm not looking at anything else because I know selvage to selvage, if I lay that down and I line that up on my cutting mat, I'm looking here and I'm just over my line because I'm going to trim this away, and I'm lined up here. I want the overhead camera to see that. So I've got 2 lineups. This is stacked directly on top of each other. I'm over the line because I'm going to trim that away. I want my selvage gone and my fold is here. Once I'm at that point, I'm going to line up. Now people say, what happens when the fabric extends beyond the ruler? This is why I like to use, I'm using the lines on the mat initially, but now I'm using the lines on my ruler. I can't see here, but I can see here. I can see that my one is lining up directly over top of that blue line underneath. I'm going to adjust that ever so slightly. It's really important that you cut these borders, one stacked right, this is stacked right on top of the fabric underneath it. Otherwise, when you unfold that strip, instead of it going straight up, it's going to come here and go like that. It's going to have a slight little jog in it. You do not want that. Do not rush this step. I'm lining up very carefully, looking at that thoroughly. I'll start my cut. I'm gonna don't move your hand. Simply move this, making sure everything is still beautifully lined up. Now I'm gonna slide my ruler up, making sure I'm still lined up along my one. Notice I'm not moving my hand. Press down and finish your cut. Now I have a nice clean edge. Now all subsequent cuts will come. I can even move off that line if I want to. All subsequent cuts will come off of my ruler. And I'm cutting 4-inch borders. And now, of course, you're just going to simply cut those borders. 4 of those across, and you have extra for one strip. I recommend once you cut your first strip, in fact, we can even cut this together. Let's do this. What's wonderful about these borders being only 4 inches is you actually have enough for 5 border strips. So you could take this, open it up. Is my border strip just running beautifully long and continuous, or does it have a slight jog? If it has a slight jog, that means your fabric is not square to itself. It's a little cattywampus, and that's why it's resulting in that. And that looks like a nice straight border to me. So I would just cut 3 more borders and simply attach those again. When we put inner borders on, outer borders, I always start with the sides, then go to the top. Same with the outer border. Start at the sides, go to the top. Again, you have the option of length of fabric, sew it on, trim to be even with the quilt, or cutting to the exact measurements. Those are in the download. Then you get to the exciting part of making the decision. Are you going to quilt that yourself, or are you going to take that to a long arm quilter? I take mine out to a long arm quilter. I don't have a long arm quilter, and I also don't have the experience. This has been quilted beautifully by our wonderful quilter in Spokane. Once you get your quilt back, of course, binding is included in your kit. You'll bind that. One thing I want to point out that's a little bit different about this kit, and is not uncommon, when you buy a quilt that is larger, such as this quilt, usually the backing is an option. So I know here at Shabby Fabrics, we thoughtfully choose backing so that it looks beautiful with the quilt. So sometimes you might use something from your stash, or you may want to choose the backing. In this instance, the backing is a separate purchase, and we used a beautiful fabric, again, from RJR. So I have had an absolute blast. I've learned a lot during this series. I hope you've learned a lot. I would love to get some feedback, some comments. I'd love to hear from you. And of course, we'll be running more series for you in the future. If you haven't subscribed to YouTube, please do it now. And I'm excited to teach you again. So we'll see you soon.